In the final days of World War II, a lone American patrol stumbled upon a Bavarian barn hiding a secret the world was never meant to see. Inside its smoke-stained silence, 200 abandoned children stared back at them, terrified, starving, forgotten by history. Orders demanded the soldiers walk away, but fate demanded something far greater. As enemy forces closed in, one impossible choice would turn an ordinary squad into the last shield between innocence and annihilation. And in that burning valley, a legacy was born, one written not in medals, but in humanity. April 1945 settled over southern Bavaria like a trembling whisper, carrying the last uneven breaths of a war that refused to fully die. The land lay in a wounded silence, a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the last traces of spring. Across broken fields dotted with shell craters and the skeletal remains of farmhouses, the U.S. patrol moved with the cautious rhythm of men who had survived too much to trust quiet scenery. The air held a deceptive stillness, the kind that often drifted over places where danger waited, unblinking and patient. And yet, beneath it all, beneath the brittle hush of a crumbling countryside, something else moved so soft it could have been imagined, so faint it could have been the wind, and yet it was unmistakably alive. Captain Samuel Hayes led the patrol with a resolve molded by years of conflict. At 28, he carried the kind of exhaustion that settled into a man's bones, a tiredness shaped not by defeat, but by witnessing the unrelenting weight of humanity under strain. His steady stride contrasted the tremors of distant artillery fading beyond the horizon. And despite the burn of weariness across his chest, he kept his senses sharpened. War had taught him that serenity was often a mask stretched over a waiting threat. Just behind him, Sergeant Leo Whitman advanced with a quiet composure that had steadied the squad through months of bitter terrain. He carried the look of someone who had long ago accepted his role as the anchor, the one who held the line when fear pressed too close. And at the rear, Private Ellis Moore tracked each step with the restless pulse of a 19-year-old whose courage ran slightly ahead of his experience, though his determination never faltered. The squad's mission that morning was simple on paper, but murky in reality. Conduct reconnaissance through the patchwork of farmland after reports emerged of scattered German units retreating south. The forested pockets and half-standing barns made ideal hiding places, and the Americans had learned that even in a crumbling Reich, desperation could turn any structure into a potential trap. As the patrol crossed a low stone wall and followed a narrow path winding toward an abandoned farmhouse, the air shifted, carrying with it a faint sound that stopped Hayes mid-stride. It was not the crisp snap of a twig or the distant hum of engines. It was softer, almost hesitant, like the trembling catch of breath from someone trying not to be heard. Hayes raised his hand, signaling the patrol to halt. The farmhouse ahead sagged beneath its burned roof, its windows shattered into jagged frames that stared blankly across the yard. But to the right stood a large barn, its red paint dulled into bruised patches, its doors closed, as though the place had been sealed by time itself. A faint, wavering noise, almost like shifting fabric or a suppressed whimper, seemed to leak from the cracks in the weathered boards. The patrol exchanged brief glances, each man reading the same grim possibility. Rumors of last-ditch ambushes had been circulating for weeks, and barns were notorious for hiding rifles, ammunition, or worse. They formed into position with the careful, practiced efficiency of men who had spent too long expecting the worst. Hayes assessed the structure, noting the sagging roof beams and the shadows pooling against the dirt. Whitman moved to the left flank, checking for movement along the side walls, while Moore steadied himself by the doorway, the faint tremor in his breath, betraying the thin line between courage and fear. The stillness surrounding the barn grew almost suffocating, and Hayes felt it press against his ribs, reminding him that every quiet moment in war carried a cost. As Hayes placed a gloved hand on the barn doors, the subtle noise inside rippled again, fragile, frightened, undeniably human. The weight of the unknown stretched the moment thin, and with a single motion, Hayes pulled the doors open, bracing for the dark burst of gunfire or the rush of hidden attackers. Instead, what spilled out was an overwhelming wave of cold air the pungent smell of neglect, and the sight of something so unexpected that it yanked the breath from his lungs. Inside, packed together in a trembling mass beneath the rafters, were children, hundreds of them. Their small bodies pressed into corners, their faces pale and hollow, their limbs thin enough to seem breakable. Some stared with wide, unblinking eyes, others curled into themselves as if trying to disappear. There were no adults, no soldiers, no guards, just the fragile presence of innocence suspended in fear. Hayes froze, the shock rippling through him with a force he could neither control nor hide. The brutalities of the war had carved deep grooves into his memories, yet nothing had prepared him for this. 200 young lives, abandoned in a barn, as though forgotten by the world entirely. Whitman stepped forward, his calm composure cracking into something heavy, something wounded by empathy. Moore's breath hitched as he scanned the rows of shivering children, each one carrying the silent imprint of hunger and cold. Hayes felt a surge of conflicting instincts rise within him, duty urging him to stay focused on the mission, humanity pulling hard in the opposite direction. The war had demanded that he build walls around his compassion, but in that moment, those walls strained under the weight of what stood before him. He reached for the radio, the device cold in his hand. Command had to know. There had to be a plan, a procedure, something to guide them through a moment the manuals had never prepared them for. Static crackled through the receiver, filling the barn with a brittle tension. Hayes released a slow breath and pressed the transmit button, his thoughts racing between protocol and the undeniable truth that these children needed immediate help. As the static shifted into a faint, distant voice, he braced himself. What came through the radio would leave him staring into the cold Bavarian air, realizing that the war's final days were about to test their humanity in ways he had never imagined. The radio crackled like a wounded thing, filling the cold barn with the familiar rasp of distant command channels struggling against static. For a brief moment, Hayes allowed himself to hope that guidance would come with clarity, something humane, something that acknowledged the unbearable sight surrounding them. But when the words finally cut through the distortion, they struck with a force far sharper than any explosion. Leave them. Proceed to objective. The sentence hung in the air with brutal finality, hollowing the space around the soldiers until it felt as though even the dust motes had frozen. No one spoke. No one breathed. The battlefield had not gone quiet from ceasefire or exhaustion. It had gone silent because disbelief had swallowed everything else. Hayes stared at the radio as though the order might reverse itself. It didn't. The static faded into an empty hiss, leaving him stranded between two worlds, the rigid structure of military command and the shivering mass of client. Children huddled in the hay behind him. The rules were clear. They were not authorized to intervene with civilians. By April 1945, Allied units were stretched thin across the collapsing Reich, their supply lines strained, their objectives shifting daily. Command feared that every deviation could compromise larger movements, and supporting hundreds of starving children was beyond anything the frontline units were equipped to do. Yet understanding the logic did nothing to ease the sickening weight sinking into Hayes' chest. Whitman's eyes hardened with quiet disbelief as he moved closer, his steady presence now shadowed by something sharp and pained. The sergeant had carried their squad through the war's darkest corridors by anchoring himself to reason, but even he struggled to process the directive. Moore stood behind them, breath tight and uneven, his eyes fixed on a young girl who clutched the sleeve of a smaller boy beside her. Her hands trembled with a kind of exhaustion only prolonged fear could create. Moore's jaw tensed, and a distant memory flickered across his expression. The face of his younger sister, back home, orphaned, when he was barely old enough to understand what responsibility meant. He had spent years trying to protect her before the draft swept him into the war. Now, staring at the girl's trembling hands, he felt that old tide of helplessness rise again, threatening to pull everything inside him apart. The children barely made a sound, their silence more haunting than cries would have been. They stayed close to one another in small clusters, holding on with thin arms and hollowed eyes, as if their unity were the only thing keeping them alive. Their presence filled the barn with a fragile innocence that felt impossibly out of place amid rotting wood, cold earth, and the distant thump of artillery echoing from unseen battlefields. Hayes swept his gaze across them, his heart sinking deeper with every face he passed. Each expression carried a story he would never know. Stories bound together by fear, hunger, and abandonment. The weight of those small, trembling bodies pressed harder on him than any order he had ever received. Whitman leaned closer, his voice steady but low, reminding Hayes that leaving them meant leaving them to their fate, a fate that offered no mercy. Without food, without shelter, without protection, the children would not survive the coming cold hours, let alone the coming days. Hayes knew it too well. The brutal logic of war demanded efficiency, demanded obedience, demanded that every soldier become part of a larger machine. But this moment was not about strategy or orders. It was about humanity, and the sharp divide between what duty required and what conscience demanded had never cut so deep. They stepped aside from the children, forming a tight circle near the barn doors. Their whispers carried a tension thick enough to fracture the stillness. Moore's voice trembled beneath the surface as he struggled to steady himself, his thoughts torn between his sister's memory and the children's fragile presence. Whitman argued with controlled urgency, his calm exterior chipped by desperation as he reminded Hayes that the squad could not turn its back without betraying the very principles they believed they were fighting for. Hayes listened, feeling the barn tighten around him, as if its very walls were pressing in, forcing him to choose. Logistics, supplies, chain of command, all of it clashed violently against the raw, undeniable truth standing barefoot on the straw-covered floor. The children were too weak to walk far, too cold to survive the night, too young to understand why strangers in uniforms now held their fate with trembling hands. Hayes felt the crushing paradox settle into his bones. He had led men through firefights, through retreats, through unforgiving winters, and yet he had never faced a moment like this, a moment where obeying orders felt like surrendering his humanity. Moore moved toward a cluster of younger children, lowering himself just enough to meet their gaze. Though he said nothing, his presence alone softened their tension. One boy extended a hesitant hand, not in hope but in instinct, and Moore felt something break quietly inside him. Whitman watched, his expression revealing the silent acknowledgement that all three of them already knew what defiance would cost but also what obedience would destroy. Hayes turned away, his breath steady but heavy, absorbing the finality of the choice forming inside him. He studied the barn again, studying each fragile silhouette as though memorizing a burden he would carry long after the war ended. The air seemed to tighten around him, the dust shimmering in thin beams of light that broke through the cracked roof overhead. He felt every heartbeat as though it were marking time toward an irreversible decision. Before he could speak, the earth beneath them shifted in a low, distant tremor. The sound crawled through the barn floor, vibrating up their boots, spreading into the walls. Hayes froze, his senses sharpening with sudden clarity. The faint rumble grew heavier, steadier, unmistakable. Tank treads. Whitman's head snapped toward the barn doors. Moore straightened, his breath catching. Hayes felt the world compress into a single, chilling realization. German armor was advancing, and they were heading straight toward the farm. The decision he had been wrestling with no longer belonged to the quiet moments of debate. It now collided with danger rolling toward them, shaking the ground with the weight of what they could no longer avoid. Before dawn fully broke across the Bavarian valley, the earth began to tremble in a low, unnerving ripple that rolled through the frozen ground like a warning too heavy to ignore. The muffled thrum of engines pressed against the cold air, each reverberation drifting closer with the slow inevitability of a storm no one could outrun. Hayes felt the shift immediately, a subtle tightening of the world around him, a realization that the moment they had feared was finally settling over the farm. They were no longer just a reconnaissance squad caught between orders and conscience. They had become something far more fragile, far more burdened. They were the last line of defense for 200 children who had already lost too much. The barn remained cloaked in the dim blue haze of early morning, its weathered beams creaking under the pressure of time and cold. Hayes had no illusions about their chances, but he refused to let fear dictate their next steps. He directed the men into motion, each instruction whispered with urgency, but grounded in the calm steadiness that had earned the squad's trust. Using sandbags scavenged from the farmhouse ruins and broken wagons near the tree line, they reinforced the perimeter as best they could. The snow-dusted fields around them offered little cover, and the rising cold made their breaths shimmer like fleeting ghosts in the air. Their ammunition was limited, their radios unreliable, and their position exposed. Even so, they worked with a determination sharpened by the unmistakable truth pressing against their ribs. Those children depended entirely on them. Inside the barn, the children gathered in cautious silence. Many clung to one another, forming small islands of trembling bodies that leaned on whatever warmth they could share. Their eyes moved like reflections of thin candle flames, fragile, shaken, flickering between hope and dread. Moore checked on them briefly, his gaze lingering on a small boy who sat near the center, arms wrapped tightly around a younger sibling. Though Moore stayed only a moment, the sight deepened his resolve, hardening it into something that steadied his pulse rather than tightening it. Whitman surveyed the field with a veteran's instinct, noting the angles of the approaching threat even before it breached the tree line. The sound of engines grew louder, their grinding rhythm echoing across the valley like steel dragging against stone. He exchanged a tense glance with Hayes, the kind of look forged from years of shared understanding. Both men knew that whatever approached was not a drifting patrol or a ragged group of stragglers. The calculated pace, the deliberate advance, it all pointed towards something more hardened. When the German units emerged at the far edge of the field, their silhouettes were unmistakable. These were not regular infantry scattered by retreat. These were remnants of SS forces, groups known for clinging to the final days of war with a ruthless desperation. Their movements were sharp, purposeful, driven by men who understood the collapsing reality around them, yet refused to yield. For a moment, time tightened around the landscape, as though the frozen ground itself hesitated. Hayes positioned himself at the front line, steadying the squad as the tension thickened. The first flash of smoke rose in the distance, signaling the beginning of the clash. Though no direct violence would be described here, the valley became a canvas of chaos. Bursts of noise, stinging cold, choking plumes of white and gray drifting across the snow. The air filled with sharp sounds that cracked against the barn's wooden walls, sending thin splinters to the floor. The children pressed lower, covering their ears, their breath folding into tight, panicked rhythms. Every strike against the wood sent vibrations through the beams, each tremor a harsh reminder of how exposed their fragile shelter was. Hayes moved between positions with a selflessness that steadied his squad. Even under the crashing echoes around them, his movements were controlled, purposeful, driven by an internal compass that never wavered. Moore held the flank with surprising composure, keeping his focus sharp despite the swirling confusion. His determination lent the squad a renewed strength, bridging their fear with something firm enough to hold on to. Whitman, posted near the primary barrier they'd constructed, endured the pressure with unyielding resolve. At one point he staggered, shaken by the impact that rattled both structure and ground, but he refused to step back. His focus remained locked on the barn, anchored by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. Protect the children, it was the mantra threaded through every breath he took. The clash stretched on in a haze of sound and drifting smoke until, eventually, the enemy line faltered. Through the frozen air, Hayes saw the edge of the German formation break, their shapes withdrawing into the tree line with the rigid, reluctant steps of a force temporarily deterred. The immediate threat began to fade, leaving only the chilling echo of its passage clinging to the valley walls. An exhausted quiet settled over the field, broken only by the soft whimpers coming from inside the barn. Hayes allowed himself a single, controlled breath of relief. The squad had held their ground. The children were alive. For a moment, hope flickered, but that hope was short-lived. As Hayes turned toward the barn, he noticed a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward from the far corner of the roof. At first, it looked like residual haze drifting from the earlier chaos, but the rising column grew thicker, darker, more insistent. He stepped forward, tension tightening through him as the smoke bled into the rafters. Then he saw the faint glow building along the upper boards, a glow that spread with a frightening, undeniable speed. The barn was catching fire. Whitman shouted for Hayes' attention. Moore rushed to the doors, his breath quickening as he scanned the growing haze. The children pressed closer together, their fear shifting into something far more desperate as smoke wound through the cracks above them. Hayes felt his heartbeat collide with panic as he realized that the threat outside had merely shifted shape. The fire was rising fast, filling the air with choking warmth, turning their moment of relief into a new, far more urgent nightmare. The flames climbed higher, the roof groaning as the first embers drifted downward. Hayes understood instantly. The real battle had only just begun. The fire moved with a hunger that seemed almost alive, swallowing timber, hay, and shadows with the same relentless force. Flames crept along the rafters in twisting currents of orange and gold, turning the once silent barn into a collapsing furnace of heat and suffocating smoke. Yet inside that growing chaos, beneath beams that crackled like breaking bones of old wood, something stronger than fear ignited. Amid the smoke, amid the falling embers, courage surged, not loud or heroic in the traditional sense, but raw, instinctive, and driven by the desperate knowledge that every second mattered. The flames consumed everything they touched, but in those moments, bravery burned brighter. Hayes snapped into motion, with an intensity sharpened by urgency. His voice, steady despite the roar overhead, cut through the thick haze as he pulled his squad and the older children into coordinated movement. They formed a human chain stretching from the barn's darkest corner toward the open doorway, guiding small bodies through pockets of breathable air. The smoke poured downward in waves, rolling through the barn like a dark tide, making every breath feel like a battle against time. Hayes positioned himself at the center, catching children one by one, lifting them through drifting ash, and passing them toward the cold morning air outside. Moore moved with fierce determination, his movements marked by a mix of instinct and memory. Each time he braced himself beneath the sagging beams, he felt the ghost of his sister's face urging him forward. He pushed deeper into the barn than anyone else, locating children hidden beneath fallen hay bales, behind feed bins, or pressed together in tight corners where the smoke collected first. He guided them through the dimming light, his hands trembling not from fear, but from resolve. The heat intensified, turning every surface into a threat as the structure groaned under the fire's spreading weight. Moore ignored the warning signs, focusing only on the next frightened child whose small hands reached toward him. Whitman directed the flow from the entrance, pulling survivors into the cold air and guiding them toward a safer patch of open ground. His voice stayed calm, even as his breaths grew ragged from the smoke. Hayes felt grateful for that steadiness, the same steadiness that had carried them through countless moments when the world seemed thick with uncertainty. But here, amidst the rising fire, that calmness was strained, stretched thin by the relentless march of collapsing beams and growing heat. Inside, the smoke thickened into a suffocating blanket. Hayes pushed through it, feeling his lungs tighten with each inhale. But the sight of terrified children still trapped inside forced him to continue. He made his way toward the far stalls where faint coughs echoed, guiding the last small group through the waves of heat. As he turned to lead them back, a deep, shuddering crack echoed across the barn's interior. His heart seized as he saw the central beam above Moore shift, its weakened structure bending under the strain. Before Hayes could reach him, the beam gave way, dropping in a shower of sparks and splintered wood. Moore pushed one final child forward, shielding him from the falling debris, but the collapsing structure pinned Moore beneath its crushing weight. Hayes lunged toward him, instinct driving him forward, refusing to let this moment close without a fight. But as he tried to reach the trapped soldier, another section of the roof began to strain, its joints creaking in warning. The fire surged, forcing Hayes back with waves of suffocating heat. Whitman saw the danger and rushed in, grabbing Hayes by the arm. His face was streaked with soot, his breath ragged, but his eyes held a fierce clarity. Hayes fought to pull away, refusing to leave Moore behind, but Whitman stepped into his path with a strength that belonged not to his muscles but to his conviction. Without speaking, without arguing, Whitman conveyed everything he needed Hayes to understand the children still needed him, and time was running out. It was a silent command, grounded not in authority, but in sacrifice. Hayes hesitated, torn apart by the moment, but another shower of sparks erupted overhead. Whitman pushed him toward the barn's entrance with the last of his strength. The heat surged again, swallowing the space where Whitman stood. Hayes stumbled into the daylight, dragged by rescued children whose small hands clung to his uniform. The survival effort continued with frantic urgency. Smoke poured from the barn in thick, dark plumes as the roof sagged deeper. The remaining men, coughing and staggering, continued pulling children from the crumbling structure until the heat became unbearable. Hayes returned again and again to the threshold, searching for any movement inside. Each time he emerged with another child, his lungs screamed in protest, his body threatening collapse. Yet he kept going until over 100 children stood huddled in the frigid air, soot-covered and shaken, but alive. The barn's collapse finally came with a deep, violent groan. Hayes watched helplessly as the roof caved inward, sending a billowing tower of smoke into the pale sky. The fire consumed the timbers in a crackling avalanche, sealing the fate of those who had given everything within its walls. For a long, breathless moment, grief held Hayes in its grip, tightening across his chest like a physical weight. But he could not surrender to sorrow. Not yet. The surviving children, shivering and terrified, needed guidance. German forces still lingered near the valley, and any hesitation could bring disaster. Hayes gathered the squad's remaining members, their faces marked with exhaustion and loss, and directed them toward the dark edge of the forest. With the barn burning behind them and the day still heavy with threat, they led the children into the shelter of the trees. Forest towered above them with a cold, watchful silence, but it offered cover, concealment, and the faint promise of survival. The once structured patrol now moved as guardians, guiding an army of orphans through snow-covered paths and tangled underbrush. Every sound made them freeze. Every shadow forced them to focus. They were no longer soldiers on reconnaissance. They were protectors, carrying the weight of lives that had been placed in their trembling hands. After hours navigating the winding forest paths, they stumbled upon the remains of a ruined church. Its stone walls leaned with age and battle damage, but it offered shelter from the cold wind and a momentary refuge from danger. Hayes guided the children inside, settling them beneath broken arches and cracked stained glass. But just as the first hint of relief eased into their breaths, a distant burst of gunfire echoed through the trees, sharp and unmistakable. Hayes' heart tightened. The danger was not behind them. It was, closing in once more. At dawn, the forest exhaled into stillness, releasing a thin mist that drifted through the branches like the last breath of a fading night. The echoes of danger lingered, but for the first time in hours, the world around them softened. In that fragile quiet, 200 children stood behind a single American soldier, their small silhouettes rising like fragile columns of hope among the trees. They watched Hayes with wide, exhausted eyes, and in their cautious stillness lay something precious, the belief, faint and trembling, that they might live. It was a faith born not from certainty, but from the quiet conviction that the man leading them had refused to surrender them to the darkness. Hayes felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders as he guided the group deeper into the forest. The path ahead twisted through thickets and roots hidden beneath patches of frost, and every distant sound forced them to pause, listening for danger threading through the branches. Whitman and more were no longer at his side. Yet Hayes felt their presence in the cold air, in the distant birdsong, and in the quiet rustle of the children gripping one another's hands. The squad that had entered Bavaria days earlier had been reduced to a single surviving officer, and yet he carried with him the unspoken strength of all who had not made it out of the barn. Through the long morning, Hayes, navigated by instinct and memory, avoiding open fields and moving along narrow ravines where the forest thickened into a natural shield. The children followed without complaint, their steps uncertain but determined. Hunger gnawed at their pace. Cold stiffened their limbs, but the will to survive held them upright. Hayes pushed through fatigue with the quiet resolve of someone who understood that every step forward was a promise, one he refused to break. By early afternoon, as the forest thinned into rolling clearings, Hayes spotted movement along the distant ridge. Through the drifting mist, a familiar glint of metal cut across the landscape, reflecting sunlight in a pattern unmistakable to trained eyes. He motioned for the children to stay low, his breath tightening as he studied the shapes emerging beyond the hill. Slowly, the silhouettes resolved into vehicles, uniforms, and figures, moving with the cautious precision of trained troops. It took a long moment before his chest loosened enough to accept what he was seeing. A U.S. relief column was moving through the valley. Step by step, Hayes guided the children into view, until the column halted in sudden confusion. Soldiers stared, their expressions shifting from disbelief to shock as they processed the sight of nearly 200 children emerging from the tree line behind a soot-covered captain whose uniform bore the scars of smoke and exhaustion. Officers hurried forward, asking for explanations. Hayes could hardly form into coherent words. He offered the facts in a steady tone, though his voice carried the gravity of everything they had endured. Command responded with a mixture of bewilderment and disciplinary instinct. The act of defying orders was clear, unmistakable, and bound by military protocol. Yet the sight of the children complicated the rigid lines of regulation. Medics rushed to the group, guiding the young survivors into trucks for transport to field hospitals. Some of the children looked back at Hayes with silent gratitude, as though they feared he might disappear if they blinked too long. Hayes kept his posture steady, though fatigue weighed heavily on him. Watching them be carried away stirred a swirl of relief and sorrow, the quiet ache of knowing he had kept them alive, yet at a cost that was still unfolding. Within hours, Hayes found himself standing before superior officers, answering questions delivered with formal precision. They noted the clear violation of orders and acknowledged the undeniable impact of his actions. His fate was not sealed with outrage, nor with praise, but with the conflicted tones of leaders balancing duty against humanity. Hayes accepted it all quietly, his responses measured and steady. He did not argue, nor did he defend himself. He merely stated the truth that he had chosen to protect lives placed before him. If that decision carried consequences, he was prepared to bear them. When the verdict came, Hayes listened with calm acceptance. His insubordination would not be ignored, but neither would it be condemned with severity. The final judgment left him with a blemished record and temporary restriction. Yet he felt neither bitterness nor regret. The children had survived. That alone made the consequences feel insignificant. He carried no desire for recognition. The world was wide with tragedies. And in the final days of the war, countless acts of mercy had gone unseen, unrecorded, lost in the tides of history. Years passed, like slow-turning pages. The war ended, nations rebuilt, and stories found their places in archives and textbooks. The barn in Bavaria became a forgotten ruin, swallowed by weather and time. The official record of Hayes' actions survived only as a brief, obscure notation in a military file, unread and untouched. Yet for Hayes, the memory remained vividly etched in the quiet corners of his mind. Still, he moved through life without seeking acknowledgement, content to live with the knowledge that he had chosen humanity over orders at a time when it mattered most. Decades later, on a calm summer morning in America, an unexpected visitor arrived at Hayes' doorstep. An elderly man stood before him with a gentle posture shaped by years of living with the weight of a childhood nearly taken from him. He introduced himself, not with dramatic flourish, but with the simple certainty of someone who had carried a long search in his heart. Hayes recognized him by the eyes, the same frightened gaze he had once guided through smoke and darkness, now softened by age and gratitude. There, reunion unfolded in quiet emotions, the kind that needed no spoken explanation. It was a moment shaped not by spectacle, but by the profound connection forged in fire and fear long ago. In the years that followed, Hayes often reflected on the countless acts of compassion scattered throughout the war's final months, many forgotten, many unrecognized. He understood now that history captured only fragments, leaving behind entire worlds of courage that existed in the silence between official accounts. One evening, as he stood in his old uniform, watching a documentary on post-war Europe flicker across his living room screen, he realized with a quiet certainty that his true victory had never been pinned to his chest in the form of a medal. It lived in the memories of those who had survived. A few days later, a letter arrived from Europe. The envelope bore the seal of a memorial foundation, and inside was an invitation to a ceremony in Bavaria. A new plaque had been placed beneath the friend, ruins of an old barn, carrying the names of his fallen squad. Beneath them, a single phrase had been engraved: "They chose humanity over orders. Hayes held the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of both memory and legacy settle gently across his heart. Step deeper into the forgotten corners of World War II, where real courage lived in silence and sacrifice. If stories like this move you, stay close. The next chapter will take you even further behind the front lines of history. There are still untold moments waiting to shake your heart and challenge what you thought you knew about war. Don't look away now. The most powerful stories are the ones the world almost forgot.